Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at some really fascinating declassified intelligence documents. These are from 1973.
Right, and they give us this unique window into how political figures were being monitored back then. It was a pretty turbulent time.
Exactly. So our mission really is to unpack these reports. We want to piece together the events they describe, try to understand some of the, well, surprising details. It's almost like you're sifting through a forgotten file right here with us.
A forgotten and pretty sensitive file.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the earliest events mentioned. There's this report from February 26, 1973, quite specific.
Yes, February 26th. What does it say?
It details a request for travel documents. Came from the Nigerian government, apparently. And there's this quite long list of names attached.
Oh, who's on the list?
Let's see. William Hauser, Melvin McNair, Jean McNair, Larry Burgess, George Edward Wright, George Brown, Jean Catherine Kirkow, and Eldridge Cleaver.
Cleaver. Okay, that's interesting because, well, the source itself speculates about that name being on the list.
Speculates how.
That maybe, just maybe, Cleaver's name was put there specifically to make the Algerians think he was still in Algiers. You know, since he'd actually left earlier that month, early February 73.
Ah, so a bit of deliberate misdirection, perhaps.
It certainly raises that possibility, doesn't it? It sort of hints at this cat and mouse game going on. Intelligence agencies, these individuals, even a name on a list becomes part of the strategy.
And it gets even more interesting because on that very same day, February 26th.
The date of the report.
Exactly. Two of the people on that list, Melvin M. Cianera and George Brown, were arrested simultaneously by Algerian police.
Arrested? For what?
Possession of handguns. The source is very specific here. It says George Brown had a loaded revolver and 2 loaded pistols.
Wow, okay. And McNair?
Melvin M. Cianera, it says, had 2 youth pistols. And one of them was specifically noted as being Chinese-made.
A Chinese pistol. That's a specific detail, but were they actually held?
Well, that's the curious part the document points out. It says they weren't held for any length of time.
Right. Not held long. So this wasn't some major crackdown, it seems. More complex than that.
Seems like it. Maybe, like you said, tactical. Or perhaps just a brief detention.
It definitely suggests things were fluid. You know, their movements, their status. It wasn't straightforward detention, maybe just a warning, or part of that geopolitical dance you mentioned earlier. Algeria balancing different pressures.
Could be. Could also be maybe they just didn't have enough for a longer charge. Or some temporary agreement allowed for a quick release.
Absolutely. That brevity, it leaves room for interpretation, doesn't it? Highlights the ambiguity you often find in these kinds of reports. Could be any number of those things playing out.
Okay, so let's fast forward just a bit. We're moving into late March 1973 now, and this comes from a slightly later report dated July 3rd, 1973, but it's looking back at March.
All right, what happened in March?
It says several Black Panther members, George Edward Wright, George Brown again, Melvin McCinair, his wife Jean Carol McCinair, plus someone named Joyce Rillerson, they all arrived in Paris. Coming from Algiers.
Paris.
Yeah.
Okay. And does the report say anything about, who was helping them there?
It does, actually. It provides some crucial context.
Which is?
It states that their lodging and, interestingly, their training while they were in France. It was all provided by Henri Curiel's clandestine organization.
Ah, Curiel. Yes, that makes sense. His network was known for exactly that kind of support. Safe houses, logistics, training for various groups, especially anti-colonial or revolutionary figures across Europe and Africa then. It shows the kind of international support structure that existed.
Right. So what does this all point to? I mean, lodging, training. The report drops probably the most, well, astonishing detail here.
Okay, I'm listening.
The group allegedly had a plan. They were trying to arrange for plastic surgery.
Plastic surgery? Why?
And false documentation. The goal, according to the report, was to allow them to secretly get back into the U.S. clandestine reentry.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a plan. Plastic surgery to change their appearance.
Exactly. And you can feel the urgency in the intelligence report itself. The source, who's only identified as Unbound.
Unbound. Intriguing code name.
Yeah. Unbound was urgently asking for any available photos of these individuals. They needed them before any potential surgery could happen and change how they looked. For identification purposes, obviously.
That urgency makes sense. But there's something else significant there, isn't there, about who knew this information?
Yes, good point. The document explicitly says Unbound had not passed this specific info to the legal attaché.
Which is essentially the FBI's main person at the embassy, right?
Correct. So keeping it from the legal attaché. What does that suggest?
Well, it points to a very contained intelligence channel being used here, highly compartmentalized, maybe because the information was just that sensitive, or perhaps the source, Unbound, was particularly sensitive themselves.
So internal dynamics within the intelligence community, different levels of access, maybe even trust.
Could be. It certainly makes you wonder about how information flowed or didn't flow, even within the same overall effort.
It raises questions about internal protocols and, well, maybe even rivalries. So if we zoom out a bit, what these reports really give us is this rare glimpse, isn't it,
Right.
into just how far people would go to evade detection.
Yeah, international travel, the weapon.
Right, the alleged weapons, support from groups like Curial's network, and then this idea of plastic surgery for secret reentry. It paints a really vivid picture of the stakes involved.
Yeah.
High risks for everyone.
Absolutely. And these aren't just, dry summaries. They feel like snapshots, full of these odd, specific details, the Chinese pistol, the urgent request for photos before surgery.
Details that bring it to life.
They do. They show how intelligence was being gathered, how it was shared or not shared, and used to track people deemed threats. It's a potent reminder of that whole complex web of, well, global politics and covert operations back then.
Definitely. And, looking at this specific case, this deep dive,
Yeah.
it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it?
Well, how many other stories like this, other hidden plans or intelligence ops, are still buried in declassified files, just waiting for someone to connect the dots and show us the full picture of these historical moments? There's likely so much more we don't know.
That's a fascinating thought to end on. Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration into the archives. Until next time, keep digging into those hidden stories within the facts.